You think you know Henry VIII? Forget the history books. Forget the sanitized portraits of the powerful king with 6 wives. The truth is a grotesque horror story they were too terrified to write. We're not talking about a king. We're talking about a walking, rotting mountain of flesh who needed machines to haul his body around. A man whose leg wounds festered so violently, the stench of his decay could be detected rooms away. A ruler whose corpse was so full of putrid gas that his reinforced lead-lined coffin literally exploded during his funeral procession. You are about to learn the sickening truths that make Game of Thrones look like a bedtime story. From the paranoid madness that turned his court into a psychological torture chamber to the unspeakable reality of his final disgusting days. This is the real Henry VIII, and it will change everything you thought you knew. Let's start with the most horrifying fact. By the end of his life, Henry VIII was a biological disaster. His waist ballooned to 54 inches. He tipped the scales at 400 pounds, the weight of 3 medieval men, a land whale of a king who could barely stand. But this wasn't just fat. His legs were a roadmap of horror, covered in weeping, varicose ulcers that oozed a constant river of pus and dead tissue. The smell was a physical assault. Courtiers would gag. Servants would literally run from the room. They drew straws for who had to perform the nightmare task of dressing his rotting limbs. And it gets worse. Modern science suggests a catastrophic jousting accident in 1536 gave him a severe traumatic brain injury. He was unconscious for 2 hours. A death sentence back then. This injury didn't just hurt him, it unleashed a monster. It explains his psychotic rage, his sudden paranoia. The charming prince was dead, replaced by a violent, unpredictable beast. Textbooks won't tell you he also likely had Cushing's syndrome, a condition that would explain the monstrous weight gain and the wounds that refused to heal. But his doctors were so paralyzed by fear, they would never dare diagnose him. To suggest the king was weak was treason, so they stood by and watched him decompose alive. This divine ruler couldn't even control his own bowels, needing special chairs carried everywhere for the inevitable, humiliating accidents. The same man who would execute you for a sideways glance. 6 wives, 2 beheaded. You know the rhyme, but you don't know the terror. Henry wasn't just a murderer, he was an architect of psychological suffering. Look at Anne Boleyn. Before he had her head chopped off, he orchestrated a sick, elaborate frame-up. He tortured her musician into a false confession of adultery. But here is the truly diabolical part. Henry forced Anne to watch as 5 innocent men, including her own brother, were brutally executed, all for supposedly sleeping with her. She had to stand there knowing she was next, watching a bloodbath her husband invented in his paranoid fantasies. Catherine Howard, a teenager, had it even worse. When he discovered she wasn't a virgin, he didn't just kill her. He passed a law for the entire kingdom, making it treason for a woman to marry the king without disclosing her full sexual history. Imagine being so pathologically petty you rewrite the legal code over a broken heart. But the mind games were his specialty. One day, lavish gifts and affection. The next, cold silence and threats of death. Catherine of Aragon was kept under house arrest, forbidden from seeing her own child, while Henry told the world she was insane. He never even read her final dying letters. And Jane Seymour, the lucky one, she died from childbirth complications, and Henry was planning his next marriage just 9 days after her funeral. To him, these women weren't people, they were objects, disposable. You think competitive eating is insane. Henry VIII's diet was a daily suicide attempt. The man consumed over 5,000 calories a day while his body rotted in a chair, but it was what he ate. A typical feast included entire roasted pigs, flocks of chickens, and mountains of bread, all washed down with gallons of wine. His kitchens were a 24/7 operation with over 200 staff just to feed his monstrous appetite. And here's the bizarre part. He believed food was magic. He'd gorge on swans to be more graceful, or oysters to fuel his virility. It was a medieval superstition played out on a horrifyingly grand scale. He was so paranoid about poison that multiple servants had to taste every dish and then be watched for 30 minutes before he would take a single bite. A simple meal became a 4-hour military operation, all while hundreds of courtiers watched in disgusted silence as their rotting king ate himself to death. Henry's paranoia wasn't just an attitude, it was the operating system for his entire kingdom. By the end, he had transformed his palace into a fortress of fear. He slept with loaded crossbows by his bed and armed guards inside his room. What else?